Thank you very much. I want to thank Perseus. I want to thank Perseus, the Memorial Human Rights Center, and the Lantos Foundation for the invitation to say a few words this afternoon. We are here for the launch of the important and deeply disturbing new report titled "The Kremlin's Political Prisoners: Advancing a Political Agenda by Crushing the Dissent." This report pulls together in one place everything anyone has ever needed to know about the Russian government's practice of throwing people in prison for political or social reasons, the how, the why, who the victims are, and the terrible mistreatment to which they are subjected. The report relies on work done by the Memorial Human Rights Center. As of March this year, the center had documented 236 cases of political prisoners, including 182 imprisoned for their religion and 54 imprisoned on political grounds. These are people accused of crimes they did not commit, or they're charged for engaging in activities that are protected under international law, such as expressing their views, practicing their religion, or gathering in public. Certain communities are targeted. Political opponents cast as enemies of the state, civil society activists, journalists, Ukrainian activists, religious and ethnic minorities, including Jehovah's Witnesses, and in Chechnya, suspected homosexuals. The full list of documented cases is included in this report, which I think you all have. The Center uses a precise, careful definition of political prisoner that takes into account the reasons someone is deprived of liberty, whether there are political motives, the use of falsified evidence, and the violation of due process protections. There is no careless language here. If anything, there is an excess of prudence. It is likely that the list is incomplete. Even so, that number of 236 constitutes a five-fold increase since 2015, a clear empirical indicator that the Russian government has doubled down on its repressive practices in recent years. The panelists that you're about to hear from, a very distinguished group, will have much more to say about the report's details. As they describe their findings, I urge you to take a look at the illustrative cases that the report highlights. We need the report's political and legal analysis to understand what is happening in Russia and to guide our response. But we must not forget that each case is about a human being who has done nothing more than follow his or her conscience. Sergei was one of those human beings. You know his case well. He was someone who was just doing his job in an honest way, and he ended up dead while in Russian custody. Sergei's story inspired me and others here in the United States Congress. We acted by passing the Magnitsky legislation that has become a key tool for shining an international light on people responsible for human rights abuses or corruption. One objective of this briefing is to discuss what more we can and should do to help free current political prisoners in Russia, to stop the practices used to target them, and to hold those responsible accountable. To that end, the report identifies several Russian high-level officials, judges, and investigators who bear direct responsibility for the persecution of political prisoners and so could be candidates for Magnitsky visa and financial sanctions, something that Congress should be working with the administration to advance. By imposing consequences for their actions, we would begin to hold them accountable and to eat away at the impunity that has enabled them to operate. The report includes a number of other recommendations that will be presented this afternoon. Another that stands out for me is the call for increased multilateral coordination. We know from past experience that the more unified our voice, the more effective our actions. So I reiterate my appreciation to the Memorial Center, Perseus, and everyone else who helped make this excellent report a reality. I want to thank you all for being here. I think this is an incredibly important briefing. So with that, I turn to Jared. Do I vote? Vladimir? Okay.
Right. Thank you so much, Congressman McGovern, both for your remarks and for your leadership on this issue for many, many years, and for hosting us here on behalf of the Lantos Human Rights Commission. In 1975, when Andrei Sakharov wrote his Nobel Prize lecture, which he was not allowed to go to Oslo to deliver, he listed 126 prisoners of conscience in the Soviet Union. The list was not full. These were the people that Sakharov knew, either personally or by name, but it did give an idea. Today, according to the Memorial Human Rights Center, Russia's leading human rights organization, there are 278 political and religious prisoners in Vladimir Putin's Russia. This is not a full list either, because Memorial uses the fairly strict criteria established in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe Resolution number 1900 of how to define a political prisoner. But it also gives an idea. And Congressman McGovern mentioned the number 236 a few minutes ago, but by the minute this report came out, it was already out of date in terms of the numbers, because this is a number that keeps growing literally by the week. 278 is the latest one. And if we take those two estimates, the shocking fact is that there are more political prisoners in Vladimir Putin's Russia today than there were in Brezhnev's Soviet Union in 1975. This is a very diverse group of people. It includes political opposition members, human rights activists, journalists, participants in peaceful demonstrations, religious believers of different faiths, Ukrainian military officers. Russia's political prisoners include people like Oleg Sentsov, a Crimean film director who protested against the annexation. People like Alexei Pichugin, the last remaining hostage of the Yukos affair, who after almost 16 years behind bars is Russia's longest serving political prisoner. And we'd really have to go back to Stalin's time to find such lengthy prison sentences for people incarcerated for political reasons. They include people like Oyub Titiev and Yuri Dmitriev, the regional leaders of Memorial itself, respectively in Chechnya and the Republic of Karelia. They include Anastasia Shevchenko, an activist of the Open Russia movement from the southern city of Rostov-on-Don, who became the first person in Russia to be criminally indicted under a new law recently signed by Vladimir Putin against so-called foreign undesirable organizations. While she was already under house arrest, her oldest daughter, Alina, who was in a care facility, died of complications from an illness, and she wasn't even allowed to be at her bedside until the very final hours. She remains under house arrest, and if convicted, she faces up to 6 years in prison for literally nothing except being a member of an opposition group. Just like in the Soviet Union, in Putin's Russia today, anti-government activity is considered a criminal offense. We often hear about the parallels and the analogies between what was happening in the Soviet Union back then and what is happening in Russia under Putin. We have political prisoners, we have no free or fair elections, we have major media outlets that have been turned into tools for government propaganda. And I don't need to tell you about the many parallels in foreign policy and international posturing. But what is different, I think, is the attitude of Western leaders, and in particular American leaders, to the plight of political prisoners in Russia. Back in the 70s and 80s, the issue of Soviet political prisoners was at the top of the agenda at every US-Soviet summit. American presidents from both parties, from Nixon to Ford to Carter to Reagan, demanded and secured the release of prominent political prisoners, prisoners of conscience, prisoners of Zion in the Soviet Union. Vladimir Drumluga, Vladimir Bukovsky, Yuri Orlov, Alexander Ginsburg, Anatoly Sharansky, just some of the names whose release, whose freedom was made possible in a very large part by top-level American advocacy. And this was not just from the White House, this was very much from Capitol Hill as well. The leaders of both parties in both houses of Congress spoke out loudly and forcefully in defense of Soviet political prisoners. Nothing of the sort is happening today on the government level. As if it is okay that in the 21st century, a European country, a member state of the Council of Europe and the OSCE, is holding nearly 300 people in prison for their political views or for their religious affiliation. And whatever else is talked about today in the context of US-Russia relations, the issue of political prisoners is notably and loudly absent. It is time to end this silence. It is time to put the issue of political prisoners in Russia back on the top of the international agenda where it belongs. I'm very grateful to my colleagues who are here on a panel representing the NGOs that have come together to produce and publish this report. I'm grateful to journalists who are writing and talking and broadcasting about this. Very grateful to leaders in the international human rights community who continue to speak out for justice for those who are deprived of it at home. I'm very proud and grateful that former Canadian Justice Minister and Attorney General Irvin Kotler has this week announced that he will be taking over the case of Anastasia Shevchenko, representing her in front of the United Nations Group Against Arbitrary Detention and other international bodies. Of course, back in the 80s as International Counsel, Irvin Kotler, he had defended prisoners of conscience such as Nelson Mandela, Anatoly Sharansky, Andrei Sakharov, Jacobo Timmerman, and many, many others. And it's a matter of great honor, deep gratitude for us that he's taking up Anastasia Shevchenko's case. But as important as the public advocacy is, there are also specific measures that can be taken to provide some accountability for these politically motivated imprisonments. And the main recommendation contained in this report is the one that Congressman McGovern mentioned just a few minutes ago. And that is, of course, the designation of those responsible for politically motivated imprisonments under the Magnitsky Act for targeted visa and financial sanctions. The whole purpose of the Magnitsky Act was to provide at least some accountability for those high-ranking human rights abusers who are fully shielded and protected by their own governments. And as I've come to know from experience over these last few years, as some of you may know, I've been involved in the work around Magnitsky legislation for many years now, since this bill was first introduced by Congressman McGovern and then Congresswoman Liliana Ros-Lehtinen in 2010. The designation of high-ranking human rights abusers for targeted sanctions is possible not only because, and I would even say primarily, not because of the actions of the administration, but by forceful and public pressure from Congress. And it was thanks to congressional pressure that many of these high-ranking human rights abusers in Putin's government have been sanctioned by the US government. And the example that's on the top of my mind, and in fact that's the person who's mentioned several times in this report, is one of the most egregious human rights abusers in Putin's government, Investigative Committee Chairman Alexander Bastrykin, whose designation for targeted sanctions under the US Magnitsky Act was made possible because of numerous congressional interventions, the most important one coming in March of 2014 with a letter to the Secretaries of State and Treasury led once again by Congressman Jim McGovern. And so we hope that the leaders of the executive and the legislative branch in this country will continue to push for the designation of these high-ranking human rights abusers in Vladimir Putin's inner circle under the Magnitsky Act where they belong. And I hope that more of these people, including and perhaps starting with Russian Prosecutor General Yuri Chaika and others with direct command responsibility for politically motivated imprisonment in Russia today, are soon designated under the US Magnitsky Act as the gross human rights abusers that they are. Thank you very much once again for this opportunity, Congressman, and thank you for everything you continue to do to help this campaign.
My name is Jared Genser. I'm an international human rights lawyer based here in Washington. Make sure you mic is on.
That's probably better, yes. My name is Jared Genser. I'm an international human rights lawyer here in Washington. I want to begin by thanking Congressman McGovern. I've had the pleasure and honor of working with him more than 15 years on countless cases and causes to advance human rights around the world. There's no better champion on human rights in Congress than Congressman McGovern, and it's a pleasure to be on a stage here with you again today. My team and I had the distinct honor and pleasure of working with some of the most extraordinary human rights heroes of our time. People like Sergei Davidis, who runs the political prisoners program at Memorial and every day puts his life on the line to just try to get out of Putin's Russia what is actually happening in the country. Vladimir Kara-Murza, of course, who was himself targeted twice and poisoned and could have very easily died, but continues to be an outspoken critic of the Putin regime. Natalia Arno, of course, who herself could easily have been on this list of political prisoners herself. She was threatened with being in prison for 20 years for her activities and had to flee abroad a number of years back. And of course, it's always great to work with some of the most renowned NGOs, international NGOs advancing human rights, and Katrina Swett, of course, who is the president of the Lantos Foundation for Justice and Human Rights, and Natalia Arno here, my apologies. Michelle Gulino, my apologies, I don't have my glasses on, but I obviously should know who you are, thank you. Michelle Gulino with the Human Rights Foundation, who's here as well. Let me just briefly describe the report itself. My team and I worked on it very closely with Sergei Davidis, and I'm just going to highlight a number of components to it. The report itself is 280 pages and 1,700 footnotes, and I'll do about a 1-minute summary or so. There are a number of unique contributions that we have tried to make with the report. The first is the first ever comprehensive analysis of the domestic laws of Russia that are used to imprison political prisoners. Not only laws that are facially invalid in violation of international law, like the Undesirable Organizations Law, but also lots of otherwise valid laws that are used to imprison Russia's political prisoners, targeting them for such crimes pretextually like murder or drug offenses or a whole range of different activities. We have a strong section in the report about the domestic Russian response to the situation of the Kremlin's political prisoners, from human rights groups, opposition political parties, and so forth. A section on the international response. What has the world done? Which unfortunately is not nearly enough, but what has the world done both bilaterally and multilaterally? And then also, as well, a section on how Putin has responded to these responses. And there are half dozen different ways, at least, that he's responded, and he has quite a clear playbook. The report also provides hope, even though the number of political prisoners has gone up enormously in the last 4 years, fivefold, from 50 to more to 278 today. We have a section on pardons, amnesties, and prisoner swaps, where you can see that intense pressure on Vladimir Putin and his regime can result in people not going to jail, to getting out early, to being part of a prisoner swap, to end up with sentences less than they might have otherwise gotten. And I think that is important to focus on, to understand that the international pressure actually matters. And of course, there's the section on the perpetrators that has already been discussed now, which is incredibly important as well. So let me just conclude, because we have a great panel here to talk about the report and what to do next, that the role of the Congress is exceptionally important, and many of you, of course, are congressional staff. And my experience as a human rights lawyer in Washington is that when you have a compelling set of facts, and you have a reasonable set of requests, and when you have strong support on a bipartisan basis from Capitol Hill, any administration which is generally reluctant to do much on these kinds of issues, as much as I would like as a human rights lawyer, ultimately will yield to that kind of pressure and will do the right thing. Again, it's always very hard, it's never easy, but progress can be achieved. And in this particular case, looking at this list of perpetrators, one of the really unique things that could happen with enormous support from Capitol Hill, especially pressuring this administration and Secretary Pompeo and Secretary Mnuchin, is for the first time in the history of the United States, roll out a set of sanctions focused on a repressive regime's system of imprisoning political prisoners. Many of our sanctions authorities are used to go after people imprisoning political prisoners in a lot of different ways and have been for many years. But there's never once by any administration, Democrat or Republican, the listing of a number of people at the same time who are part of the entire system itself. And to me, that could be something very, very important to happen. I'm obviously not going to speak publicly about our strategy going forward from here, but I'm more than happy to talk to individual staff privately about our strategy. And there's a long road ahead. The last thing I'll say as well, of course, is that this report is not written just for the United States, it's a global report. Streakin, who's already on the U.S. sanctions list, is one of the 16 names in this report. And we're going to take this report on the road globally and talk about it and engage support all around the world. But the greatest fear of any political prisoner that I've ever represented in my career is to be forgotten. That is undoubtedly their biggest fear. And it's important to understand that when you're talking about large-scale imprisonment of political prisoners, as both Vladimir and Congressman McGovern noted, we're talking about live human beings with a photo, with a story. They're three-dimensional people with families that are suffering because of their imprisonment. They're being tortured or suffering in enormous other ways. And to tell their stories publicly is to shine a bright light on the repression, in this case of the Putin regime, and to hold to account the perpetrators is one of the most effective ways, in my view, to put the kind of pressure on the Kremlin that we have seen in a lot of other contexts in relation to these kinds of prisoners has resulted in their freedom. So we desperately need your help and support, and thank you very much.
I'm Sergei Davidis, I represent Human Rights Center Memorial, and I was glad to collaborate with the new organized coalition for release of Kremlin's political prisoners, and with Genser group that has prepared this comprehensive report. And I'm glad to have this ability to speak about Russian political prisoners here. As it was already said, our lists of political prisoners are not complete. and total quantity of political prisoners should be considered as 2 or 3 times more than we have in our list. So it's not less important than certain names, those are included in our list, the trends which take place. And we see that not only the total number of political prisoners is growing and is getting higher every year. We also see that prosecutions are getting more severe. Average prison term, according to court sentence, is also getting longer every year. We see that state efforts realized and exercised and politically motivated imprisonment are directed to suppress any independent self-organization and any independent organizations, especially organizations connected with some foreign countries, so those are supposed to be connected with foreign countries. And it especially concerns religious organizations. 2/3 of our lists are people who are persecuted for the exercise of religious freedom. There are some representatives of different Muslim groups, there are Jehovah's Witnesses, and the numbers is also getting higher every month. But anyway, general motivation of the state while executing politically motivated imprisonment is to control the society. And now when the state doesn't have enough money to buy loyalty, when propaganda is getting less effective, this tool of politically motivated imprisonment is getting more important, and it's especially important to oppose it now. And we see that even now, under these circumstances, it happens so that public pressure, both from inside Russia and outside Russia, is effective. We have some cases when people were released due to this pressure. We have some cases when people got conditional terms instead of real terms those were expected. And now, if due to this report, due to this new coalition, those are very important new steps towards more wide public pressure to Russian authorities. This pressure can be more effective, and it's especially so because the level of public support of Russian authorities is decreasing. So all the officials who face before the choice whether to violate or not violate human rights will have to hesitate looking at the people who has already been sanctioned according to Magnitsky list and other procedures. So I think it's very important to move further, and it's important not only from humanitarian point of view, but because possibility to control the Russian society by means of politically motivated persecutions allows Russian authorities to be aggressive out of country. So it's not only important because of rule of law and human motivations, but it's reasonable. Thank you.
Hello, Natalia, Arno, I'm president of the Russia Foundation, and my organization is one of 4 leading human rights and democracy promotion organizations that commissioned Perseus strategies to produce this report. First of all, let me thank Congressman McGovern for your strong position on human rights and for your continued support. Let me thank the Lantos Commission for organizing this, Kimberly Stanton, and let me thank you, audience, for your interest to the subject of political prisoners. But most importantly, let me thank Memorial for working on this report, and especially for all Memorial's work on this subject of political prisoners, on the list of it, on many other important projects. Sergei, when you see a list of political prisoners, it's Sergei, Davidis, and his colleagues' work, and he goes back to Moscow tomorrow. Let's all acknowledge and admire the work and give him a round of applause. Thank you. This is the most comprehensive report on political prisoners yet produced. But as proud as I am to share with you this hard work of many, many months, it's with a larger sadness that we had a reason to produce this report. It's a compilation not just of people who have spoken out against Putin's regime and paid a terrible price, but it's simple evidence that leadership in my home country has lost completely its values toward human rights. Everybody here mentioned numbers, and it's very astonishing how fast the situation in Russia deteriorated. Vladimir mentioned Sakharov's speech. I remember his own speech at Oslo Freedom Forum in 2016, when he said that it's quite unimaginable that there are 80 political prisoners in Russia. Well, since then, 3 years later, the number tripled. And even when we produced our report, the numbers are already outdated. It's already not 236, but it's already much more. And as Sergei says, the actual number is even twice or 3 times more. Numbers are important and they're terrifying, but behind each number is a human life, a human story, a human tragedy. And the reports tell us not only about the categories of political prisoners, but about concrete people. And so rather than presenting this report today, it would be much more pleasant to discuss what new documentaries the Ukrainian filmmaker Nemtsov has produced, or what new articles journalist Guriev released yesterday, or journalist Rudnikov have written, or what new research Professor Bobashev have conducted, or what new lectures Nastya Shevchenko has organized. The topic of imprisonment as one of the cruelest means in this Kremlin's arsenal of tools of how to suppress the opposition is very important and quite familiar to me. Jared mentioned I myself could have ended up on this list of political prisoners. I was working for 10 years for a democracy promotion organization. I see one of my colleagues in the audience. And for this work, I was threatened to be in jail for 20 years, so I had a choice of being in prison or leave my own country and lose my motherland. It was an easy choice, but a very hard decision. But at the same time, it's important to note that a confident leader of the country would see no reason to murder, to poison, to force out, or to jail its political opponents. A leader that claims a great popularity should find no need to worry about a single mother of 3, and now of 2, Nastya Shevchenko, for organizing debates. Or he shouldn't be afraid of 2 young people wanting to organize a regional protest, Yan Sidorov and Vladislav Mordasov, who just made 2 posters, 30 flyers, and purchased a megaphone. Or he shouldn't be worried about the people's tweets and Facebook posts, or about those who catch Pokemons and blog about it. These are the signs of a desperate dictator. The report has a very in-depth analysis and explains what international laws Russia violates. But why to be surprised that Russia violates any international agreements, charters, conventions, if it violates its own constitution, which guarantees freedom of speech, assembly, association, religion beliefs, and political participation? Today, we woke up to the news, well, 2 pieces of news actually. The first one is that Putin signed into law this legislation on Russian southern internet, and also that the Russian authorities detained a lot of protesters, especially in St. Petersburg, peaceful protesters in a authorized rally, again violating our right, our freedom to assembly. One of the very important chapters of this report, in my opinion, is domestic and international response to the Kremlin political prisoners. Despite an increasingly hostile environment, many Russian civil society organizations, journalists, human rights defenders tirelessly advocate for the release of political prisoners. They collect information, they protest, sign petitions, do many other things. And also a growing Russian pro-democracy exiled community support them, and it holds this advocacy campaign to the international level. For example, our Free Russia Foundation, from the very first days of our establishment in December of 2014, started this advocacy campaign, especially for the release of, for the release of Ukrainian hostages of the Kremlin. Nadia Savchenko, Roman Sushchenko, who is even not on the list because he is accused in espionage, he's a Ukrainian journalist, and Memorial cannot obviously get access to his material, so he's in this list, which is bigger one. Crimean Tatars, 24 Ukrainian sailors, the case of Klik and Karpyuk, and of course Nemtsov, and yes, many others. But at the same time, we should remember about these political prisoners, not when they're on the hunger strike like Nemtsov was for 145 days, but every day and until they are all released. In the 21st century, it's absolutely shameful and shouldn't be tolerated that even this phenomenon of political prisoners exists and that its number is growing. It shouldn't be tolerated that people who want free and fair elections are in jail and those who falsify elections are not. It shouldn't be tolerated that people who dare to criticize the corrupt and criminal Putin's regime are in jail, and the corrupt and criminal officials who conduct these criminal activities inside Russia and beyond it are not. It shouldn't be tolerated that people who want to speak up, who say that they want a free and democratic Russia are in jail, and those who impose propaganda and censorship are not. And it's also very wrong that fair trials is rather an exception in Russia, but tortures are more and more typical and more widely spread. So let's all of us join to our campaign to release Kremlin's political prisoners. Thank you.
Thank you, first, Jared, for the invitation and the introduction. The Human Rights Foundation is very proud to have co-commissioned this report to Perseus Strategies, and I feel very privileged to be here amongst these remarkably resilient individuals, many of whom themselves have been targets of this authoritarian regime. So thank you to everyone who made this report possible and today as well. So, we've certainly seen that it's important for Russia and Putin now to attempt to control and suppress all different forms of communication for civil society actors. So I wanted to build upon some of the points that were mentioned with regard to civil society actors, particularly given the trend that we're seeing now of increasing pressure on civil society members. And to give you a sense of exactly where our organization is coming from on these issues, why we believed it was just so important to be commissioning this report, and also provide some examples of how specifically civil society actors based on the ground in the US are able to advance the message about the plight of Russian political prisoners. So I think our mission statement at the Human Rights Foundation provides a good blueprint for understanding exactly what the forces are at play in Russia. We are advocating for freedom and democracy in 94 closed societies that we focus on. So those would be competitive authoritarian regimes and fully authoritarian regimes. And amongst that latter category, certainly there are some major key players who we would identify as really a few leaders of malevolence, and certainly Russia falls into that latter category. And from a policy perspective, Russia is quite unique in the sense that not only is it conducting these nefarious activities domestically, but also we see those transferring abroad. We see that when they're entering on the ground, invading other countries, crossing numerous lines across a variety of issues. And we also see this in terms of how they use their veto power on the Security Council to attempt to block all forms of legitimate means to be advancing international law. So I think what mostly we've seen in international headlines is news about what Russia's been doing abroad and all of its actions abroad. But so this report, what's really amazing about this report is now we're getting to see an inside look specifically of what is happening in Russia on the ground and the astonishing number of political prisoners that exist within Russia. And the Human Rights Foundation, our chairman is Garry Kasparov, who himself was a political prisoner of conscience. And so he's been able to use our platform with the Human Rights Foundation in order to be speaking to the Parliamentary Assembly and the Council in Europe, for instance, to mention all sorts of examples by which the Kremlin really has essentially made a mockery of these European courts and any semblance of democratic means and concepts of justice by repeatedly simply ignoring the results that are coming out of the court against it. So what we see is kind of on a superficial level, they're paying the fines that are required of them, but then that's really where the discussion ends in terms of their requirements for responding to the retribution. And Natalia mentioned the Oslo Freedom Forum. That is something that the Human Rights Foundation produces every year. It's a global conference where we bring together leading voices of dissidents. Vladimir has spoken with us. We've also had Boris Nemtsov's daughter, Zhana, along with former political prisoner Mikhail Khodorkovsky. And every year at this event, we honor and recognize those who have been real leaders in creative dissent. And we recognize them with the Václav Havel International Prize. And in 2014, we awarded this prize to members of the Russian feminist punk riot group Pussy Riot, just days after two members had been released from prison for staging what was a mere 40-second politically charged performance. And one of the members of the group, Nadia Tolikonikova, she made the point that really whatever is human in this regime is destroyed by Putin and his cronies. And so I think that's something that's really evidenced in this report in terms of the torture that we're seeing that these political prisoners are enduring. And there's been discussion talk about there's a thaw in the number of political prisoners that's happening. But something that we really want to stress is that simply releasing and pardoning some political prisoners does not equate to a thaw. And that there is no true thaw in the number of political prisoners currently in Russia. And so just last year, 2 days before Putin was reelected for the 4th time, we hosted in New York the PutinCon, which was the first conference of its kind, the inaugural one, where we brought together leading activists and members who had specifically been targeted by Putin, attacked and cheated by the Kremlin in various different ways. And one of the things that we heard coming from every single one of them was really the need to be hitting Putin and his cronies exactly where it's going to hurt them. And that is their pockets, really. And that's something that at the Human Rights Foundation we're working on in our anti-corruption initiative now. So we really need to be following the money that's flowing from Russia into these Western safe havens like the United States, and using targeted sanctions under the Global Magnitsky Act, as has been mentioned, to do so. And we know that these cronies are criticizing the West, yet simultaneously they're stashing over $800 billion of their wealth abroad in these countries where they're choosing to live, vacation, send their children to schools. So I think now we need to make sure that Putin's cronies are really put in a corner in which they need to make a decision between whether or not they're going to decide to protect their personal financial interests abroad, or whether or not they're going to be continuing to follow these criminal acts that are coming from the top. Because really in a culture of criminality like the one we see in Russia, the process of naming and shaming is clearly no longer working, and it's just simply not enough, and we need to be doing more. And if we look at the narrative surrounding the cases of political prisoners that are detailed in this report, and they're jailing. We're seeing that really dictators such as Putin himself are acting out of fear. And if he looks strong, he'll survive whether or not he actually is strong. So what we need to be doing is focusing on honing in how can we make him appear weak? How can we undermine his reputation? And so I think that's why this report is really crucial, because it's an important step into looking at how to precisely investigate what is happening, and it's providing examples of the exact crimes that have occurred and the treatment that these prisoners are going through. And it actually, for the first time, is really identifying individuals, 16 people who we can really be targeting throughout command and line responsibility. So I think taking steps toward joining forces, so that would be joining our coalition that the members here today are all a part of, compiling these case file submissions under the Global Magnitsky Act, and then really just ensuring that impunity no longer has the opportunity to beget further impunity. And these are, I think, tangible ways that we can really send a message to Putin and his cronies. We can be doing work on the ground in the US that will have tangible effects abroad, and make it clear that it's the West's mission to be very resolute in this, and ensure that we can bring about a difference for the prisoners abroad in Russia. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Katrina Lantos Swett, and I'm here representing the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice. And some of you may have noticed that this briefing is sponsored by the Lantos Human Rights Commission. So the foundation which I head, the commission which Congressman McGovern is the chair of, are both dedicated in their own way to forwarding the legacy of my late father, Congressman Tom Lantos. He was, as some of you may know, the only survivor of the Holocaust ever elected to serve in the Congress. He used to tell his colleagues that he had a very unique perspective on America and its role in the world, because he was the only member of Congress to have experienced brutality and oppression of the right under the Nazis, and then to have experienced brutality and oppression of the left under the communists. And so he understood in a visceral, deep way that few others could match how important American leadership was and is when it comes to standing up for the fundamental values that underlie a civilized world and a civilized society. I'm very grateful, as others have expressed, to Congressman McGovern for his leadership and for the work of the Lantos Commission. I'm extremely both grateful and impressed by Jared Genser and the work of Perseus in creating this really, really tremendously significant report. I hope you will take the time to read it, because with Jared's usual brilliance and thoroughness, he has created a report that is, on the one hand, incredibly densely packed with the goods. The goods are in there about who is being victimized and who is doing the victimizing. And it's not just a narrative, which is very readable, but those 1,200, however many footnotes, give you all of that sort of backup and verification to make it clear that this is no mere exercise. This is a very serious and substantive work, which we hope to use to move the dial not only on the cases of these individual prisoners, and I appreciate Natalia in particular saying, there are numbers and there are narratives, but then there are living, breathing human beings behind each one of those cases. But, as Jared said, we have a broader mission, which is to target this abusive system. And that's sort of a daring new bit of territory in some senses for human rights organizations like ours. Typically sanctions and naming and shaming have been done more on a one-off basis, trying to win this person's freedom, fighting for that person's reputation and name, identifying a particular abuser. But we have created in this report a very compelling list of 16 perpetrators. And that is, in and of itself, a powerful statement. We know who you are, We know what you have done. We have an understanding of how you do it, and now the world knows. Just before I came over here, I had the opportunity to meet with Mikhail Khodorkovsky. He was hoping to be with us today, but he had some other obligations this afternoon. And as I'm sure many of you in this audience know, and everybody up here on the stand knows, Mikhail was one of the very first. He was much more than a canary in the coal mine, but he was in a sense a canary in the coal mine because he became the first sort of focused target of Putin's wrath. And he became the first truly larger-than-life, powerful figure, Russia's richest man, who Putin intended to use as an object lesson for all of the rest of Russian society. Look what I can do to this powerful man. Look what I can do to this billionaire who is known the world over and has vast resources and who has created one of Russia's great companies. I can take him and with a targeted false campaign of accusations and allegations, I can bring the force of our government to bear on him and to crush him, to steal what he built and created, to throw him into prison, to target all of his associates and colleagues. This is my power. Watch and beware. Well, Mikhail survived that onslaught, that decade-long onslaught, now works outside Russia through the Open Russia organization and other ways to try and continue to support civil society and rule of law and democracy and freedom in Russia. But as we were meeting today, I remembered back to when he was still imprisoned, and we were working on his behalf. And I met at that time with Elie Wiesel, who sadly has left us. Every time one of these great, great figures from that generation, those who survived the Holocaust, those who went on to become voices of such moral authority and of such clarity. You know, I weep a little inside. I know that we can't keep them forever, but it is, we lose something when they leave us. But at the time, this was some years ago, my organization, the Lantos Foundation, was working on behalf of Mikhail's freedom, and we were interviewing Professor Wiesel for a movie, a documentary we were making about him. And he said at the time, something that has stayed with me ever since, he said, you know, Putin is a little Stalin. He is not a big Stalin. He's not a real Stalin. There are no vast quantities of millions of people being targeted and starved and killed and brutalized. But what motivates him and what drives him is the same spirit that drove Stalin. But he's smarter in a way. In this day and age, you don't need to commit these atrocities on a vast scale. You just need to do it enough to instill fear and terror in the vast majority of people who know things are not right in their country, who know things are not as they should be, but who may not have the courage in the face of the danger that they see, in the face of the attacks that they see taking place against those who do put themselves out there. And in some senses, the results can be very similar. When Jehovah's Witnesses, when political activists, when a wide range of people, human rights activists, civil society actors, journalists, lawyers, when they are targeted for the sorts of abuses that are chronicled in this report, the purpose is indeed to sow fear across the society. What we hope this report will begin to do is to reverse engineer that a bit. We hope to sow a little bit of fear in those perpetrators. We hope perhaps to make their sleep a little less peaceful at night, their vacations a little less enjoyable as they contemplate the fact that their deeds are now recorded and named, that there is a coalition, and we hope it will grow bigger and more forceful and more powerful, that is working to get the United States of America and other countries to use the tools that are out there now. The global sanctions, the Magnitsky sanctions, the travel bans, and the asset forfeitures and freezes, to make it difficult for them to continue to live their big, rich, happy, corrupt, and cruel lives. We want them to be afraid. We want them to know that we are on this and we are not going to give up. I think it's been mentioned that from among those of us up here on the panel, Sergei is heading back to Russia in is it tomorrow? Yes. And I think that should give us all pause. You know, the one thing that I find most ambivalent, if I may use that word, about my work and my activism in the field of human rights is that it is always undertaken from a very comfortable place and a pretty comfortable perch. Here I sit in this lovely room in the capital of the United States, and I'm going to hop on a perfectly pleasant little commuter flight back to my home in New Hampshire today, and I'm going to hop in a cab, and I'm going to grab a bite of dinner here and there, and my life is so secure. But those who live in Russia, those with the courage like Memorial to research and to record the facts and the evidence, they are in fact in danger. And you know, a few months ago I had the opportunity to testify before Senator Rubio about a very different matter. It had to do with China and internet freedom and a number of very great challenges with China's both brutal oppression of human rights domestically and efforts to export their influence internationally. And one of the members of the panel said, how can we ensure, though, the safety of the people we're speaking out on behalf of? I said, we can't. There's absolutely no way of ensuring the safety of those in authoritarian societies who are daring to do the right thing. But what we can do is by carrying their cause forward, by raising our voices on their behalf, by naming them when they become a target, by naming their perpetrators, we can not only perhaps protect them from the very worst abuses that they would otherwise suffer at the hands of these abusive regimes, but we can embolden them and strengthen them. We can let them know they are not alone. They are not forgotten. Their cause is our cause. And so our job is the easy one. We do it, as I say, from a place of safety and with lots and lots of protections all around us. But even that little that we do, it can be transformative for them, for those who are in the trench, stepping into the breach and fighting the fight on behalf of the universal values and the universal human rights that really do constitute the veneer of civilization. I guess I should close with that quote. Some of you may know it from my late father. It's become kind of the guiding motto of the Lantos Foundation. He said, and he knew whereof he spoke, he said, the veneer of civilization is paper thin. We are its guardians, and we can never rest. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katrina. Thank you, Michelle, Natalia, Sergei, and Jared. Katrina, I remember some years ago now, your father hosted Anatoly Sharansky in this very room, and he always did call him Anatoly, just as he called him back in the early 80s when he called very loudly and passionately with his release. And it was such a powerful statement to see a free political prisoner and a member of Congress who spent his life, dedicated to freeing them. So I hope that in a few years' time, or maybe even sooner, the Lantos Commission could have an event with one of those people who are pictured on the front page of this report, sitting with us here in freedom. We are technically out of time, but we will take 2 or 3 very quick questions, and if we could take them at the same time, and then let the panelists respond. And if you could please very briefly identify yourself and direct a comment or question to all of us or to anyone in particular. Please.
I'm Joshua Salman from the International Republic Institute. First, I'd like to thank you all for this incredible piece of work. And while it's impressive how thorough it is, it's also sad that to produce such a thorough piece of work, it must be so thick. It seems to me that there's two things that strike fear at the heart of Putin. The first is sanctions, and I'm glad that that's a key recommendation in the report. But I'm curious about the second, which is the fear that Putin will lose control from below the system. And I'm curious what can be done to support the domestic responders that are mentioned in the report, the activists, the journalists, the leaders of civil society who are ultimately the ones that can ensure that the political prisoners are not forgotten and that the world knows about them. What can be done to ensure that they keep working safely, effectively, and that their work isn't in vain? Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have any other comment, question? Please.
I'm from the Kara-Murza's office. I just had a quick question about Paul Neal. He's an American who was detained in December. So I guess the question for anyone on the panel is, how do we stop future Americans from being detained in Russia? And is there any way we can get Paul Neal back in a safe manner?
Anyone else? Please.
Yeah, my name is Charles Lee. I'm from the Global Service Center for Putin, the Chinese Communist Party. This government has named Russia and China as the strategic challenges to this country, but there's also a thinking about unite with Russia against China because China is much bigger in terms of economy and military development. So I just want to see what you guys think is that possible to really for the United States to unite with Russia, to work on China? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we'll just go briefly in addressing whichever aspect you want to address. I'll very quickly touch on your question about support for civil society and people who do defend democracy inside of Russia. That's actually a fundamental, very important point because too often, and those of us who are Russian on this panel, I think we take this, this is a very sensitive issue, frankly. When people in the West, using high parliamentary or government rostrums, paint the whole of Russia with one brush. And even rhetorically, they say, Russia this, Russia that, abuses by Russia, behavior by Russia. In effect, equating a country of 140 million people with a small group of crooks who are sitting in the Kremlin. And that is, first of all, why the Magnitsky sanctions are so effective and so important, because they are targeted, because they assign responsibility where it's actually due, as opposed to blaming everyone. But the other side of that medal is exactly the point that you raised, that while being, taking a very principled and very committed stand in relation to those human rights abuses and corrupt crooks in the Kremlin, it's very important, in my view, for Western democratic countries to maintain very vigorous, active, and direct people-to-people contacts with Russian society, with Russian civil society, with those many, many people inside of Russia who are deeply unhappy about the direction of the current regime and want to see a very different Russia, a Russia that would respect both the rights and freedoms of its own citizens and will behave as a responsible member of the international community. And not least, those people-to-people contacts are important to build the bridges that both of us will need when things start changing and when there'll be another era and a time for a better relationship between the West and a democratic Russia in the future.
Actually, I can answer only about the same question Vladimir has already answered. Anyway, for people who fight for democracy and human rights in Russia, it's very important to feel support. And the second important issue is that they are opposed in their fight by means of restrictive legislation, of repressions, and opposing these tools the state uses against them is very important. For sure, for example, today we had peaceful rally in St. Petersburg and 66 people were arrested and beaten just for participation in peaceful action because the slogans were criticizing the authorities. And for sure it's important that public attention was attracted to these events, to so blatant violations of human rights. And there is rather huge attention to this violation inside Russian society. Those strata of Russian society who are interested in human rights react to these violations. They support each other. And it's very important that these people get support from abroad also. And principal position of foreign governments on the legislation violating human rights, on the human rights violating practices is very important also. And as for defending American citizens from persecution, I'm afraid there is no simple receipt, because actually he proved to be a hostage of Kremlin's regime, like Ukrainian citizens and many other people. And there is no special tool to release only him. General fight for rule of law against dependent courts, against unfair judges can help him like many other foreigners and Russian citizens.
I would agree that the first question was the simplest, but at the same time is a very important one. Solidarity is very important. Any other help, of course, moral support, financial support, trainings for Russian civil society, how to organize advocacy campaigns, so they are also important. I remember when we just started Free Russia Foundation, and it was our first advocacy campaign for Natalia Savchenko, and we had like zero resources, but we just needed the information. I see in the audience one of my partner organization, Justice International, and they helped us to find an American lawyer who would write a legal opinion about your case, and there would be not much information about your case, not much trust also to Russian lawyers. But again, to do this legal opinion, this American lawyer had to just get accustomed with your case materials, like 80 volumes, 200 pages each, and we just asked people everywhere, like on social media, through partners, like please help us to translate from Russian into English, and so many volunteers in the US and Canada, in Finland, in Ukraine, in Russia, everywhere, just joined together, and in 2 weeks they're able to translate everything. It's huge work. So again, anything like that is very, very helpful. What is great about this report, each person on this list is important, and we should advocate about each of it, but it also gives us, like the entire list, it's all of them are important, we should advocate for all of them. It's not only Americans now, and the Kremlin, again, being a mafia state, they need this as a leverage, as a like trade and so on. And now more and more foreigners are imprisoned, Norwegians, Americans, and Estonians, and so on. Again, it should be our joint campaign. What are they afraid most of all is sanctions. Everybody understands that. I believe that Boris Nemtsov was murdered primarily for his advocacy for Magnitsky Act, and I'm sure Vladimir was poisoned twice also for this activity. I myself was under the most surveillance in Europe when I would meet with members of the European Parliament, and we would discuss expansion of Magnitsky Act in Europe. So this is a very sensitive subject for the Kremlin, and like we should target it then. And right now, how many 6 countries have this act? How many are implementing? Like UK 0, and so again, all together.
Well, I mean, I think it's difficult to say precisely how we can avoid people from being detained, but one of the tools that some society members can use, and particularly those with legal capacity to do so, is, and something the Human Rights Foundation does frequently, is writing petitions to the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. And that's a semi-judiciary body that we found has a much faster response time than many other bodies that you might be working with within the UN. And that's not to say that when a decision comes out, the individual will be released immediately, democracy will immediately be restored in Russia. It's a process. But now the current generation, the most recent generation in Russia, they've only ever known one person in power, and now they're the ones who are of voting age. And so hopefully they too will now be inspired to enlist in coming up with additional mechanisms for those in detention. And then I would also look to, I mentioned that the European Court of Human Rights is often made mockery of by the Kremlin. But on the flip side of that, we have to look at, for instance, in 2018, 72% of applications that were coming in were from 6 countries, and a huge number of those were from Russia. So it was, I believe, out of 56,000, almost 12,000 of those were based on human rights infringements in Russia. And that was a 4,000 application increase from the prior year. So it's clear that the Russian populace does place some amount of faith and recognition in these more legitimate avenues for justice. So I think that's something that we also can't discount, despite the fact that the Kremlin has mostly, for the most part, disregarded decisions coming out of it, but it's something that I think we need to continue to support, and obviously greater mechanisms for accountability need to be developed within that, but I think that's something that we can't discount at the same time.
I'm going to take a slightly different approach, which may not be directly responsive to your question, but obviously for the last 2.5 years in the United States, we have been obsessed with Russia. Not because of their human rights abuses, not because of the terrible abuse of rule of law and corruption at home, but because of their efforts to meddle in our election. I think it would be really a good thing if we could turn this new American heightened awareness and heightened suspicion and heightened anger, if you will, at Russia in the direction of saying, hey, what Russia did to our election, that was wrong and that was bad, and hopefully we will be prepared to avoid and be vigilant to those threats in 2020. But, and this is a point that Jared was making earlier today in some of our discussions, why was it that Putin, excuse me, I shouldn't say Russia, I apologize, Vladimir, that Putin felt sort of free and at liberty to engage in this election meddling mischief? It's because he has systematically crushed dissent and political opposition at home, and that frees him up to some degree, despite the weakness of the Russian economy, to engage in all sorts of international bad actions and bad playing. We saw it just yesterday in Venezuela, which is in our own hemisphere. You know, that's kind of interferes with our old-fashioned Monroe Doctrine. We don't like that. But Putin could not have that sort of running room, that freedom to be such a bad actor, if he had accountability at home. How do we have accountability? How does any system have accountability? Because there's a degree of freedom, there's a degree of democracy, there's a degree of rule of law. You know, we've just gone through this whole excruciating process in our country where, you know, the person occupying the highest office in the land was subjected to a 2.5-year investigation by an independent counsel. That's a very healthy thing. Even if, whatever you may think about the investigation, that's the sign of a healthy society, that not only are there constitutional checks and balances, but there are norms that check and balance the behavior of leaders. Putin has crushed those norms, he has changed the laws, he has ignored the Constitution, and because he targets these individuals and sends that message of fear to everybody else, he's free to be such a bad actor in the world. So I would say that something all of us can do in our sphere is to try and push these issues about human rights in Russia, not just Russian election meddling, but human rights, rule of law abuse, and corruption in Russia into the upcoming presidential campaign. We need to find opportunities to get all 20 of those Democratic candidates, I think I have the correct count, and to get President Trump and whoever else may be running on the Republican side on the record on these issues. That's the thing, of course, that drives the Putin world crazy the most, is when they are talked about, when the light is shown on these things. We have that opportunity. You know, there will be debates, there will be events, there will be fora, there will be untold numbers of occasions when the public has a chance groups have a chance, organizations have a chance to say, well, what about this? What are you going to do about this? Are you aware of this? Have you read this report? If you want to get a copy of this report and take it and personally give it to candidates running, you should do so. We should try to put this issue into the lively and vital debates that are going to be unfolding now in the next year and 4 months of our presidential election, and get this issue of the outrageous human rights abuses of the 200 plus prisoners of conscience, get it into the debate so that Americans are talking about it, so that the next president of the United States, whoever it is, has been forced to say something in a public forum on it, and make sure you've got your filming it. And we need to sort of leverage this political moment that we're in to try and push this issue more into the spotlight. And on the China question, it's a very sophisticated question. I guess my bottom line feeling is that China and Russia, in their respective ways, are both the most powerful bad actors in the world. There are other bad actors that maybe are worse than the two of them, but none from such powerful and significant countries. And we cannot, we should not compromise our essential values by trying to leverage one against the other.
Thank you so much, Katrina, and thank you so much, everyone, for coming and being with us here today. Thank you.